Baker Botts, LLP, provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice and are not intended to establish an attorney client relationship. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Welcome to the Environmental Evolutions Podcast, where we explore the changing landscape of environmental law and policy. My name is Scott Novak, and I work as an associate in Baker Bott's Environmental, Safety, and Incident Response Group. One of our goals with this podcast is to hear a variety of perspectives from folks with environmental expertise. And as a reminder, any views expressed on this podcast are not necessarily the views of Baker Botts. On today's episode, we're focusing on how the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA for short, is changing under the Trump administration. To do so, we are joined by Vicki Arroyo, who served as Associate Administrator for Policy at EPA throughout the Biden administration. She is now back as an environmental law professor at Georgetown Law, where she previously served as Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center. I should also disclose that I was lucky enough to have Vicki as one of my environmental law professors, and I previously worked as a fellow at the Georgetown Climate Center during her time there. Vicki, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you again.
I'd like to discuss your time with EPA under the Biden administration. What were your priorities as Associate Administrator for Policy?
So, the portfolio for EPA's policy office is very broad. It includes rulemaking, navigating interagency reviews, economic analysis, reviewing NEPA documents of other federal agencies, community revitalization work, climate adaptation. And for the first 18 months, we also had the Environmental Justice Office in the Office of Policy. That was until the administrator at the time, Michael Regan, spun that off into its own large office that was going to have a seat at the table the same way that the media offices like air and water, solid waste, et cetera, have for many years because he prioritized environmental justice, as did the president and all of us. When I first went in, I was surprised to find a demoralized and traumatized staff. It took some time to get to know the staff, even though I had served at EPA before, to learn about what they had been doing, support their work, and incorporate our priorities, which included environmental justice, climate change, and other efforts. I was surprised to find that the total EPA staff and budget in 2021 were roughly the same as when I first joined EPA out of grad school in 1987 in the
Oh,
Ronald
wow.
Reagan era. Yeah, exactly. So it really struck me when I came in that we were going to be really limited in what we could accomplish given staff and funding limitations on par with the 80s. Yet now we had huge issues like climate change, PFAS, with more to contend with.
That's interesting. It always strikes me as I feel the same way about the courts and the amount of judges we have. Our population has expanded by tens of millions, yet we have similar infrastructure. I didn't know it was like that at EPA at first. Did it change during your time there in terms of the appropriations and resources that you had?
It has. The biggest benefit was the funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a shot in the arm for EPA and other agencies. A lot of positions were temporary appointments, but we had good people seeing we were trying to do great work on clean energy, environmental justice, and climate. So many exciting things, work with communities on the energy transition. We had people leaving roles in cities, consulting firms, think tanks to come over, even if a permanent position wasn't promised. But a lot of the positions that we did have that were new to the agency in the years that we were there were these temporary appointments. EPA has been around since 1970s. People who served with me my first time around were starting to go into retirement and create some opportunities for younger people to make a career there as well.
It sounds like you had a lot of different topics under environmental policies. Can you give a sense of what day-to-day life was like for you?
Every day I started in meetings no later than 8:30 because every single day, mostly in person, we would meet with the administrator, deputy, his chief of staff, Dan Utek, and other associate administrators and the general counsel. So basically Michael Regan's kitchen cabinet. I have to say, it's daunting to be in a conference room every morning at 8:30, but I found it to be a really great practice for any organization, especially if you have a lot of priorities, you have a lot of events, you have issues that emerge quickly. And if you think of EPA, we do all of those things, right? If you think of EPA's role, for example, in disaster response, like East Palestine or the fires in Maui. We had to have boots on the ground immediately to deal with cleanup of some of the hazards. On rules and having an opportunity to weigh in, I would move those rules to OMB for interagency review or up to the administrator for signature. We were improving and streamlining permitting processes, working with communities on issues that were important to them, with federal advisory committees, businesses, stakeholder groups, trade associations, other folks who came in. I and my team did a fair amount of interagency work and White House activity because there were a lot of interagency working groups in the last administration. I, of course, spent time dealing with OIRA almost every day, if not every day, on rules, because that is very much the job of the policy office, and with CEQ on environmental reviews and guidance with the Permitting Council. And we did have a little time to identify opportunities and needs and some gaps and to launch new programs and websites. For example, we did launch a new permitting website to have more of a one-stop shop where people can have some more transparency about what was happening with their permit, or groups from the outside could see where permits like Fast 41 and other tools. We also launched a new site on resources on climate adaptation while I was there. So it was a really broad portfolio, which made a lot of fun for me.
That's awesome. And yeah, what a wide ranging portfolio. Out of all of that, what are you most proud of EPA accomplishing under the Biden administration?
I'm very proud of the team. We built both the political team, people that I was able to hire, not very many political appointees, but also the career team, especially providing opportunities for people to become career SES who had served in the agency for decades and really bring them over maybe from a different part of the agency or a different federal government entity altogether, like the Park Service, where we brought somebody from a heavenly location in the Virgin Islands to lead one office within EPA. I'm really proud of the team building, but also just the collective body of work of all those folks. The career staff and the political leadership worked so hard on really life-saving rules that can also provide tremendous economic benefits. We completed dozens of major rulemakings under our statutes that collectively provide for hundreds of billions of dollars in net benefits, from avoided energy cost and avoiding illnesses and hospitalizations, avoiding lost work and school days, cancer, and asthma attacks and more. I've been thinking of our first administrator who returned in the Ronald Reagan era, Bill Ruckelshaus, who directed EPA to follow the science and follow the law and do our work with transparency. And that was something we really had top of mind. Administrator Regan, Michael Regan, and our team, who helped to inform a new strategic plan for the 4 years we were there, also added an equity pillar because it's clear not everybody can have the advantages of clean air and clean water. Childhood experience, I knew that to be the case and had worked in Louisiana on reducing air toxics and EPA on that before. I was happy and proud to be part of a group that recognized and elevated that role. My proudest day was when the administrator signed the Han NESHAP, a way to reduce air toxics from large chemical and petrochemical facilities that are often co-located with other chemical and petrochemical facilities.
What parts of your job did you find most challenging?
I loved the portfolio. It was broad and exciting. It was never dull, but every day there was something new, sometimes something I didn't plan on. The pace was relentless after 4 years. A lot of people don't stay 4 years, but I did. It's really nice to be here at Georgetown in another community that I call home, the same way that it was like a homecoming to go back to EPA, and to have more time to reflect and share lessons through my teaching and conversations like this. I feel like that's the right thing for me now. It was really incredible to be part of an amazing team at EPA doing amazing work, both political and career staff. After 4 years, I had decided it was time, no matter what happened with the election, to come back to Georgetown and to teaching.
That's excellent. Well, Georgetown is very lucky to have you. I tell any student who's at Georgetown and talks to me about environmental law, make sure you take a class with Vicki Arroyo
Thank
because
you.
she's amazing. So, turning to EPA under the Trump administration, EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has announced 5 pillars that will guide the agency's work. These pillars are: 1, clean air, land, and water for every American; 2, restoring American energy dominance; 3, permitting reform, cooperative federalism, and cross agency partnership; 4, making the United States the artificial intelligence capital of the world. And 5, protecting and bringing back American auto jobs. What do you make of these new priorities for the agency?
So the first one, clean air, land, and water for every American, as I said earlier, all the way back to the Bill Ruckelshaus days, is very consistent with EPA's longstanding mission of protecting health and the environment and implementing statutes, right? Of course, to me, though, that would support making sure that communities that have not always enjoyed clean air and clean water and land, those overburdened by pollution, some would say EJ communities are protected. So to me, it begs the question why this administration's attacks on EJ, because you really can't deliver clean air, land, and water for every American if you don't really see what's happening in those communities and acknowledge it and figure out how you can actually do better. We need to do better. And that was a focus of our last administration, but we certainly didn't solve all those problems. Restoring energy dominance, it's interesting because that's not EPA's statutory role. Every agency has to map out how the people on your staff are implementing your statutory obligations, right? That's not really EPA's statutory role. But I will note that the US was quite dominant in the whole range of energy sources under President Biden. Yes, certainly on renewables like wind and solar in particular, which was taking off for a variety of reasons, cost and state policies and IRA incentives, but also on gas and oil production, which surpassed Trump's first term and hit record levels under the Biden administration. So we have now President Trump declaring in an executive order an energy emergency, but at the same time, he's also issuing presidential memoranda calling for the end, essentially, of offshore wind. And it's puzzling. Why are those electrons not important to our energy dominance, energy supply, manufacturing jobs, et cetera? On permitting reform, the Permitting Council under President Biden was working actively on that with agencies like EPA in keeping with the Fiscal Responsibility Act that was passed. And we and other agencies were taking steps with a new website to increase transparency and cooperative federalism. Should be cooperation with all states, including states that want to lead as well, is always important. And I would just like to say it doesn't seem to be happening as much with the California waiver for a CRA determination, which was never the case before. Many grant programs that benefit the states are being frozen. On the point about AI, I'm certainly not an expert. I occasionally attend meetings for EPA if others were not available to go in person. EPA does have obligations, of course, to make sure that the growth in electricity from data centers and AI can be done in a way that protects human health and our environment, which is EPA's mission. And of course, EPA's power sector rules play a role in doing that, right? In achieving those economic ends, but making sure that people who live around there and all of us from a climate emissions perspective are protected. And then finally, on the manufacturing, people can look at the statistics, but under President Biden, manufacturing grew tremendously, often in parts of the country that didn't have these jobs before. The bipartisan infrastructure law, of course, and IRA provided a real shot in the arm for manufacturing through incentives, through Buy American requirements, through the development of charging infrastructure that made it more likely that people would buy those electric vehicles. But by supporting innovation as opposed to doing things like tariffs or just declaring that they should be located here, I just don't think that's going to work. And I don't think we should cede leadership in electric vehicle production, for example, to China.
More recently, on March 12th, Administrator Zeldin announced EPA will undertake 31 historic actions in the greatest and most consequential day of deregulation in U.S. history. These actions include reconsideration of regulations regarding many industries, including power plants, vehicles, and the oil and gas sector. What do you think the most potentially consequential action on this list will be?
So that was a dark day for EPA, and I had to wonder what his motivation was. Each of those actions should go through its own regulatory process, notice and comment rulemaking for most of them per the APA, or statutes like the Clean Air Act have other requirements for public engagement. The administrator himself having to be the one to weigh in and sign. All of that has to happen. But the benefit of those actions far exceeds the cost by hundreds of billions annually. It's puzzling that the Environmental Protection Agency, whose mission is to protect health and the environment, would really declare such an attack on the very regulations that it's promulgating to protect health and environment. It's hard to pick favorites. I mentioned the Han rule earlier, not on this list, but this suite of rules affecting pollution from power plants under various authorities like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act would be right up on the list, along with regulations on methane pollution from oil and gas operations. These built on programs and emission reduction standards that states were already promulgating. And so again, EPA, I felt like finally was getting around to regulating methane, a very potent greenhouse gas pollutant. I am puzzled at why we would not move forward with those, especially since many states are already operating under methane rules. The vehicle standards, which have tremendous benefits, clean car and clean trucks rules together have annual benefits of $106 billion. The heavy duty vehicle standards were another 17.8 billion. And collectively, 11 of those 31 rules and policies accounted for $215 billion in annual net benefits and nearly 200,000 avoided deaths.
It's interesting when I was taking a look at the headline where the headline is, of course, this is going to be deregulatory actions, but most of the bullets state we're going to reconsider. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been thinking about it in the context of Loper Bright and
Hmm.
how much agency discretion will the courts give to EPA when, yes, right out of the box, they're declaring that they know what they're going to do on all of this? Where's the deliberation there, right? How are they really following the statutes if they've prejudged that analysis? And how much deference will the courts these days give to a regulatory agency? Not that much if you follow the new law of the land since they've rolled back Chevron. I think it's a really interesting question. I was puzzled with what he was doing that day because you can't deregulate in one day. What was the purpose of that at that moment to make all that noise about reconsidering a number of things, some of which, frankly, we already knew were going to be reconsidered because the executive orders had already mandated that, including, for example, the social cost of greenhouse gas numbers that my own team at the National Center on Environmental Economics generated through a rigorous process. So good luck to them because that really does represent the best available science. I'm quite convinced.
On EPA's list of deregulatory actions is reconsideration of the 2009 endangerment finding regarding greenhouse gas emissions and actions that rely on that finding. Can you explain what the original endangerment finding is and why this finding is important?
In the Supreme Court case of Massachusetts versus EPA in 2007, the court held that greenhouse gases fit the definition of air pollution under the Clean Air Act if EPA finds they endanger human health or the environment. And in 2009, based on extensive evidence, scientific studies, and assessments, greenhouse gases were found by the Obama administration, by Lisa Jackson as administrator, to endanger health and the environment. Even under the George Bush era, EPA found that, but we're not allowed to act on it. We all know that over time, the documents were sent to the White House, who didn't really want to see them at the time. So it really got postponed a bit. But this is now 15 years later. And obviously, we are facing even more endangerment from the rising emissions, the impacts that we're already seeing, mega storms and fires and floods, sea level rise. So we know that we're even more endangered now. And the importance is that several of Clean Air Act rules are based on the definition of endangerment and the finding.
What arguments do you expect the new administration to advance to reverse the endangerment finding?
Well, I just want to say, I really find it hard to justify any arguments, again, based on science and our own personal experience. The impacts of climate change have become more dire and compelling over the last 15 years. What I saw in that announcement, and again, it was really policy by press release, if you will, there was a number of political appointees from the Trump administration dumping on the endangerment finding with quotes saying that the finding should consider factors like costs or the other downstream effects of making that finding to the rulemaking process. But obviously, finding whether or not something is an endangerment objectively doesn't require those considerations and would be improper. It does seem that they might be trying, it's early days. It's hard to know what their rationale is, but it does seem like they might be trying to make a distinction between endangerment that was found in Mass versus EPA. That was a petition that had to do with the vehicles and say that the endangerment in that part of the act didn't necessarily associate with other endangerment language in the Clean Air Act. But I don't think that will carry the day. They're raising questions about the basket of gases considered in tandem, whether vehicles, which is more than CO2, because there's refrigerants in vehicles, or other greenhouse gas emissions or other parts of the Clean Air Act emitted by different sectors. The courts have ruled on this many times. The DC Circuit found the endangerment finding sound. The Supreme Court in AP versus Connecticut pointed to the new source performance standards part of the Clean Air Act and said that's really the horse you got to ride. Don't be suing over here under common law nuisance, which might really be reopened if they try to make all this go away. Your clients might be concerned about that. This is not the first time that this question has been raised, and the science has been clear. And Congress, of course, passed and the president signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which itself actually notes that that's the state of the science, that greenhouse gases have been found to be endangering pollutants under the Clean Air Act. You have not just legislative history, you have duly enacted legislation. So I don't really see it, but I guess this is just one of the many ways that they're spending the time of a workforce they're trying to deplete at the very same time. It's very appalling to hear what they're talking about in terms of 65% cuts that was mentioned by the president in a cabinet meeting. They've gone back and forth of whether or not that's the staff or whether or not it's the budget. But either way, as you heard from me, it was pretty flat to begin with, except for the infusion, which was huge from Bill and IRA, but temporary, right? So who's going to do all this work of rolling back all these rules if you cut over 1,000 scientists into positions of all the people, whether in probationary status, promoted recently, or joined the agency recently, sometimes giving up other jobs or being a consultant with expertise. If you cut all those people and demoralize the staff, who's going to do all these rollbacks? Who's going to try to argue against endangerment in 2025?
What would the practical consequences be if EPA successfully reversed this finding?
So I don't see that happening. But if it does, the question in my mind is, do they somehow think that this is going to absolve them from having to carefully go through the notice and comment rulemaking process to roll back all those regulations that have been duly enacted before the CRA window gave them a shot at it? That's not an option anymore to veto it that way. I don't see how they can do that without greater risk. This whole thing, all these threatened rollbacks, cannot be good for regulatory certainty and for responsible companies that just want to know what the rules are. I've been at this for some time, and I know from companies at the Pew Center on Climate Change that they just want to know what the rules are and have a level playing field. Right now, of course, it's just chaos. And it's going to take time for all this to play out. All of it's going to be litigated. From a climate leadership perspective, it's right up there and horrendous looking with the Paris Agreement. It's a terrible message. But also just from a business perspective, from a regulatory certainty perspective, that's really so important for businesses to function and be productive and profitable. It's going to be a challenge for the next several years because all this stuff is going to be heavily litigated. And I think they're going to lose a lot, just like they did in the first term.
Another significant change at EPA is the elimination of the programs related to environmental justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion. They screen, a free online mapping tool companies use to identify communities impacted by pollution and inform project siting, is no longer live. What do you anticipate the practical consequences of these actions will be?
The screen was developed years ago, including by someone in my office, the Office of Policy, but he contributed along with several other people to improving it, improving accessibility, adding layers. People on my team also work to add some climate consideration and vulnerability layers. And I think it's just another example of how pledges to protect every American are false. If we're not allowed to see where people live and which communities are most affected by this pollution and these other risks, this hits home to me because of growing up in Louisiana and working in those plants upriver of New Orleans, where emissions have grown even despite efforts that I was involved with to pass legislation successfully that cut emissions back of air toxics by 50% over a 4-year period around the time that the debates about the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 were happening. So that part of the Clean Air Act hadn't already been revised, and it had been slow going for decades. Places like Louisiana really had a lot of pollution that we just decided to take matters into our own hands, even in Louisiana. we did that. But those plants have just exploded both in number, size, and emissions. It's very sad that with other websites and databases, this administration is just taking down all this data that we as the taxpayer have paid for. And it's alarming. I see outside groups stepping up, capturing and reposting some resources, but this should be something the government is hosting. We as taxpayers created it and should benefit without a wild goose chase and figure out whether or not some of these things have been captured accurately.
If we ever have another administration with environmental justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities more similar to the Biden administration, have you given thought how they may go about restoring eliminated programs and initiatives?
I've worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations at the federal level. And even the governor I worked for, who was a Democrat when I started working with him, Buddy Roemer, switched to become a Republican while in office. Changes happen and administrations can take their focus in a new direction. Coming back after Trump 1.0, it takes time to revive a traumatized and mistreated staff. And I know I was surprised at the personal toll that the previous Trump era took on the staff. I was aware of the Clean Power Plan I worked on at Georgetown, the policy changes from Obama to Trump to Biden. But the personal toll was less public and cruel back then than we are seeing now, where we have people like the OMB director bragging about causing trauma to the federal workforce, and Elon Musk wielding a chainsaw, bragging about cuts. People have put their life's work into this, and their livelihoods are at stake, and their communities, really, by extension, and families. I don't know how we recover from that. I've been worried about the pipeline for new talent because they've gone after programs like the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, like the DOJ Honors Program. These are like the best and the brightest, right? They could go anywhere, but they choose to go into government. Even the federal trainings that I would send my kind of mid-level staff that really stood out so that they could eventually become senior executive service members one day. They were cutting those programs. They are cutting those programs. I just wonder how government can recruit and retain the best talent if people are treated that way. It's going to take generations to rebuild trust. In the time we were at EPA, we were rebuilding trust. We were seeing the employee viewpoint survey results of satisfaction going up from rock bottom to where it just was reported from last year, number 2 to NASA. So very proud of that. You can turn around an agency if you treat career employees with the respect and let them do their jobs. We were, as I mentioned, recruiting people under IRA and bill, even temporary appointments. People were giving up great full-time jobs to come in and get a chance to work on these things. So I hope that will happen again.
Is it safe to say, just from what I recall during the last Trump administration, of course, there was differences in policy shifts that come with changing administrations, but I don't recall such a focus on laying off so many people en masse.
It's alarming. They're talking about dismantling the Office of Research and Development. That's over 1,000 scientists. Going back to Administrator Ruckelshaus and his values to follow the science, the law, and be transparent. How do you follow the science if you're firing 1,000 and more, really, scientists from not just ORD, but from around the agency? How do you follow the law if you take shortcuts that don't allow for public comment or peer review? It's demoralizing, but it's really appalling. And it is so public and transparent, and they don't seem to care this time around about that.
So, final question. Do you have any advice for companies who may have to navigate between drastically different priorities at EPA every 4 to 8 years?
Yeah, I can sympathize. And I'm sure many listeners are already grappling with how to try to find some stability in navigating all that's happening. I think it might be temporarily or it might seem beneficial to switch rhetoric and actions to fit the times in this administration. I personally think that would be a big mistake. And I think it would really entail real risks, reputational risks, the ability to recruit and keep great staff and clients. We're already seeing this with some firms and universities. There's real pushback and concern of staff and potential new staff and clients. For firms and clients calling for regulatory certainty for so many decades. Where possible, they should continue to support the rulemakings that we already had on the books that were finalized. They are moving through the courts. The courts have not necessarily let those be abandoned yet at this stage, or call for rollbacks. Climate change and its impacts are only getting worse. So I think questions that people should be asking themselves is, what are we doing to position our firm and our clients to deal with that? Even your own physical plant and operations, when you think about sea level rise, fires that are more severe and extensive, and floods. What about business continuity, your clients, supply chains? How can you be proactive to be part of the solution, including on the front end, on the mitigation side of climate change as well? There are so many wins now. The cleaner energy economy transition is well underway and more affordable, often cheaper to invest in. And of course, state leaders like California, the EU, also other countries, they're not going to go away. So I'm seeing a lot of postings right now of jobs that I'm elevating for my students and friends who are looking. ESG jobs are out there. There's going to be work on these things because California has, I think, something like 70% of the companies operate there. So whether or not SEC moves forward with those regs, California is moving forward. The Europe with the omnibus even is moving forward. The world has moved forward on vehicle standards. Maybe even carbon pricing will come back. It has survived challenges before at the state and regional level with Reggie and California. So I think it would be a disservice to put your head in the sand or to become lazy because some pressure seems to be off on clean energy and efficiency, environmental justice, basic fairness. But I do think this is like a moment to step up, be a leader, and do the right thing. If people and firms do that, they won't be sorry.
Well, Vicky, great advice, and we will end there. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on Environmental Evolutions today.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for listening to this Baker Botts podcast. Baker Botts has the experience, knowledge, and people to address our clients' most significant legal issues. For more information on Baker Botts practices, please visit us at bakerbotts.com. This presentation is provided by Baker Botts LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.